So is that to say then that thinking and relationality are conceptually synonymous? Because at the very beginning, are they conceptually synonymous? Because at the very beginning of the letter on humanism, within the first page, I think he says, thinking accomplishes the relation of being to man. Yeah. And in using the word accomplishment, he's using a non-causal sense of the term, and then, like you're saying, throughout the rest of the essay, he very strongly complexifies both of these conceptions of thinking and accomplishment and relationship. Yeah. So yeah, relationality then as thought, but a thought which is the withdrawal.
Yeah. Yeah, but yes, and then he follows that by saying, but we haven't learned to think yet.
Yeah.
And the letter on humanism in part, and being time, are like a slow catechism in the act of learning how to think. Because it says, well, you have to really drop everything. You have to drop regimes of intelligibility. You have to drop ordering principles. You have to really excavate yourself. You have to, in fact, open yourself to the language of withdrawal. Now, thinkers like we've been talking about, Butler and Hales and Haraway, are thinkers of withdrawal. That's the magic element of their thinking. That's the nobility of their thinking, that they put into language. They think their way into language. And after all, Heidegger, in the opening pages of the letter on humanism, says that language is the house of being. And, interesting comment. So that's the case, and one could think of these contemporary theorists of critical feminism as, as the first signs of a new form of thinking. But it's a form of thinking that thinks into withdrawal. And how could they not think into withdrawal? Because they wish to reclaim their gender, their sexuality, their intelligibility in a culture that threatens to vaporize them. This is their only possibility. And that's, I think, their particular predicament is really emblematic of the general human predicament.
Carrying on with Heidegger, but switching gears then slightly. The letter on humanism was written, I think, in the late 1940s. And so a lot of...
47, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Some people will argue that there's a split in Heidegger's work in the 1930s, a famous turning, and before that his work was decidedly different. And so you might characterize a work like Being in Time differently than you would the letter on humanism. And so I'm curious about an interpretation there, because he argues in Being in Time that Dasein is constituted principally or equiprimordially by a network of relations with others. This is being with others. And so this is clearly a relational concept in some sense, although it's maybe one of an ontological set of units that Heidegger is later less explicitly concerned with when he moves to the language of appropriation and so on. But he also talks here not just about the present and being with others, but about coming to the present from the past and about being projected toward the future. So being is bounded by a threefold temporal horizon.
Yeah.
So the question here is there a sense in which being in general, maybe in the sense of this threefold temporal horizon, rather than being with others specifically, in the sense of the present, is in some sense relational? Maybe to take it back to your interpretation of the letter on humanism earlier. This is an unpleasantly ontological and philosophical question, but I'm really curious to see how you interpret that, being as such, in terms of thought or relationality.
Yeah, well, that's true for Heidegger. I'm not saying I agree with that, but that's true for Heidegger. And Heidegger, that's this temporal dimension of being for Heidegger is what he calls care. And care is the movement of thought out of the past, conditioned by the present, and projecting itself into the future itself. And it's a relationship. It's within the context of and a relationship to the house of being itself. It's a way of approaching the truth of being, the aletheia of being. That's care. So that's the ontological constitution of relationality, where relationality is the keynote of this perspective itself. It's decidedly relational, and it's relational in the relationship to being as such. So, end of answer with that sense. But then I had this kind of niggling thought. I've been reading Peter Sloterdijk recently. There's a new book just arrived, just very nice translated book called Neither Son Nor Death. I think not Son Nor Death, but it's close to that. And it's really nice because it's got a reflection on letter and humanism as well. It's a really very good reflection, in which Sloterdijk says, he discounts, he embraces Heidegger, and the whole essay is haunted by Heidegger. He says for him, in the end, Heidegger sides with Heidegger is really giving us God talk in thinly veiled terms, turns to cosmology, to the question of being as such. And Sloterdijk himself wants to move to a form of relationality that's implicated in the question of history. Although I notice at the very end of the essay, he ends the essay with the uncanny and the nameless and the knowability itself. He's haunted by Heidegger in some ways. So, for myself, if I can just go back to the earlier discussions we had, is that the thinkers of complexity and hybridity and uncertainty in human existence, really stand in opposition. They simultaneously complete Heidegger because they follow a Heideggerian method of thought. They in fact give honor to the name of a form of thought which embraces fully into itself the language of withdrawal. Their thought withdraws into that which withdraws. There's a certain nameless and homeless quality to their thought itself. But at the same time, it's decidedly the case in all of their thinking that there's no being as such, and that there is most adamantly no truth of being. Because truth of being simply puts us back into the cycle of metaphysical history once more, and which is fine, but it's where we're experienced. But these are thinkers of critical feminism that seek to break with that. All of our metaphysics, and Heidegger takes his place within this, have been marked by a threefold movement, three core metaphysical problems. The problem of salvation and institutions of conversion, mobilization of opinion, perspectives, credences of faith, absolute conceptions of fideism, which emanate from that. Problems of order, which is where Heidegger begins in his earlier thought. Problems of mobilization, the nihilistic consequences which will emerge from cultures which are in their totality, politically, epistemically organized around problems of order itself, and problems of freedom, problem of Marx itself. So, the problem of Karl Marx starts. So, this problem of salvation, order, and freedom are really the three, I call them, after Stephen Pepper, like the world-dominant world hypothesis. And Heidegger does not break that chain of metaphysical being. Heidegger simply alternates it. He moves between all three. He ruminates pessimistically on problems of order, the question concerning technology. Letters on Humanism is he uses a language of cosmology to sharpen his thought on the nihilistic consequences of the culture of extremism that he sees emerging everywhere around him, problems of ordering. And he translates us into the language of freedom by moving to poetry. I mean, for Heidegger, the language of freedom is explicitly articulated as language which is given its voice in the house of being. And we will find that language most eloquently expressed in language of poetry and of art. I mean, it's no mistake that he goes to Rilke and to Holderlin as his nameless philosophers of root. So Heidegger, I think, is to be understood in a larger cosmology himself in terms of the wheel of metaphysical history. And for myself, and just to conclude with this, for myself, I stand with another strand of thinkers, the homeless thinkers, like Arthur Rimbaud and Nietzsche and Klosowski, all of these thinkers who are aware of order, freedom, and salvation as the great epistemological problems, but prefer not to be motivated by any of those. Be conscious of them, but to seek out the nameless in other directions.